General George S. Patton is remembered as the relentless hound of the Allied advance, a man who boldly declared his tanks would only stop when they reached the heart of Berlin. But history has a habit of lying through omission. The uncomfortable truth, heavily buried in the archives, is that Patton's legendary blitzkrieg across France in the summer of 1944 was mere hours away from complete and catastrophic paralysis. The German High Command wasn't terrified of Patton's tactical genius at that moment. According to captured diaries and post-war testimonies, some German generals were actually laughing. They had done the math. They knew the American supply lines were stretched to the absolute breaking point, and they confidently predicted that the entire Allied war machine would soon suffocate under its own weight. They were absolutely right about the math, but they were fatally wrong about the men who would rewrite the rules of modern logistics. Welcome back to the archives. I am Henry, and today we are pulling the classified files on a miracle built entirely on sweat, diesel, and sheer human desperation. This is the story of the Red Ball Express. It is the largely untold chronicle of 23,000 exhausted truck drivers operating under conditions that defied human endurance, who shattered German military assumptions and single-handedly saved the liberation of Europe from grinding to a humiliating halt. To understand the sheer scale of this crisis, we must step back to August 1944. The Allies had successfully broken out of the Normandy beachheads during Operation Cobra. The German army was in full retreat, and the race across France had begun. It was a moment of supreme triumph, but it masked a terrifying reality that kept Allied commanders awake at night. Armies do not run on morale, they run on beans, bullets, and above all, gasoline. A single armored division on the move consumed an ocean of fuel, and the Allies had armies, not just divisions, sprinting eastward. By late August, the front line was advancing at a staggering pace, sometimes pushing 50 miles a day. But the supplies were still sitting on the beaches of Normandy. The French railway system, which should have been the arteries of this advance, had been systematically pulverized by Allied bombers prior to D-Day to prevent German reinforcements from moving up. The major ports, like Cherbourg, had been heavily mined and sabotaged by retreating Nazi forces, rendering them useless for immediate large-scale unloading. The Allies were victims of their own spectacular success. The distance between the combat troops and their supply dumps was growing exponentially every single hour. Patton's Third Army and Hodge's First Army were consuming roughly 800,000 gallons of gasoline every single day, just to keep the engines idling and the tracks turning. Every mile they advanced tightened the logistical noose around their own necks. Reports from the front were becoming frantic. Tanks were literally running dry in the middle of fields. Artillery units were rationing shells. If the fuel stopped, the advance stopped, giving the battered Wehrmacht the precious time it needed to regroup, dig in, and turn the borders of Germany into an impenetrable fortress. The war could be prolonged by months, perhaps years, costing hundreds of thousands of additional lives. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his staff faced a mathematical impossibility. Traditional logistics dictated that you advance, consolidate, build forward supply bases, and then advance again. But stopping was not an option. The momentum had to be maintained at all costs. Out of this pure, unadulterated desperation, a radical, almost insane plan was born in a frantic 36-hour planning session. If the trains couldn't run and the ports were dead, they would build a massive, endless conveyor belt of rubber and steel right across the heart of France. They called it the Red Ball Express, a name borrowed from railroad terminology, where a red circle denoted high-priority, fast freight trains. But this was no train. It was a fleet of nearly 6,000 cargo trucks, primarily the iconic 2.5-ton GMC CCKW, affectionately known as the Deuce and a Half. The rules established for this operation were draconian and unprecedented in the history of warfare. They requisitioned a loop of French highways, designating one route exclusively for outbound, fully loaded traffic, and a parallel route for returning empty trucks. It was a closed circuit, hundreds of miles long, Civilian traffic was strictly banned. Military police were stationed at every intersection to enforce the absolute law of the red ball. The trucks must never, ever stop. There were no speed limits, only minimum speed requirements. The vehicles were to be loaded, driven, unloaded, and driven back 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a relentless, mechanical rhythm. To the German observers who eventually caught wind of this, it sounded like an American bluff. No human force could sustain that level of driving without collapsing. Yet, on August 25, 1944, the first convoys rolled out, their bumpers marked with a distinctive red disc. The greatest logistical gamble of the Second World War had officially begun, and the burden of saving the Allied offensive fell onto the shoulders of men who had been largely marginalized by their own military. The burden of the Red Ball Express fell overwhelmingly on the shoulders of African American soldiers. This is one of the most profound and often overlooked paradoxes of the Second World War. At the time, the United States Armed Forces were strictly segregated. Black soldiers were routinely subjected to systemic racism and were frequently denied combat roles by commanders who falsely believed they lacked the courage or discipline for the front lines. Instead, they were relegated to service and supply battalions, tasked with the grueling, unglamorous manual labor of the war effort. Yet, in the late summer of 1944, the fate of the entire European theater rested in their calloused hands. Nearly 75% of the Red Ball drivers were African American. These were men who had been told their contribution was secondary, but who now found themselves executing the most critical operation on the continent. The official regulations of the Red Ball Express looked neat on paper, but the reality on the cracked French asphalt was a descent into organized madness. Trucks were supposed to travel in organized convoys, maintaining a strict distance and a steady speed of 25 miles per hour. In practice, the desperation for supplies meant these rules were routinely shattered. Drivers pushed their overloaded vehicles to 40 miles per hour or more, hurtling down narrow country roads that were never designed for endless columns of heavy military traffic. The physical toll on the men was staggering. A standard shift was supposed to be manageable, but as the front line pushed further east, the round trip stretched to over 400 miles. Drivers routinely spent 2 or 3 straight days behind the wheel without meaningful rest. Exhaustion became a far deadlier enemy than the retreating Wehrmacht. 2 men were assigned to each truck, taking turns driving while the other tried to snatch fragments of sleep on the hard metal floorboards or slumped against the rattling passenger door. But sleep was a luxury few could afford. To keep the supply line invisible from the air, night driving was mandatory, and it had to be done in near total darkness. To avoid drawing the attention of roaming Luftwaffe fighters or artillery spotters, headlights were strictly forbidden. Drivers had to navigate the treacherous winding roads using only narrow slits over their headlights, known as cat eyes, which cast a feeble, ghostly glow barely a few feet ahead. Imagine driving a heavily loaded 2.5-ton truck, packed to the brim with 5-gallon jerry cans of highly flammable aviation fuel or crates of high explosives, down an unfamiliar, cratered road in the dead of night, staring blankly into the abyss. The strain on their eyes and their nerves was unimaginable. Hallucinations were common. Men reported seeing phantom buildings or non-existent roadblocks, slamming on their brakes and causing massive pile-ups. Trucks routinely careened off the roads, tumbling into ditches or wrapping around ancient trees. And yet, the convoy could not stop. Disabled vehicles were simply shoved off the road by armored bulldozers to keep the vital artery flowing. There was no time for mourning or recovery. If a truck broke down, ordnance mechanics worked miracles in the mud, cannibalizing parts from wrecked vehicles to keep the survivors rolling. They operated makeshift repair depots under the open sky, changing blown tires and ruined transmissions while covered in grease and shivering in the damp French nights. The route itself was a gauntlet. Retreating German forces had left behind a lethal legacy of snipers, isolated pockets of resistance, and unmarked minefields along the shoulders of the roads. A simple flat tire could become a death sentence if a driver pulled over onto an uncleared patch of dirt. Furthermore, The local French infrastructure was crumbling under the sheer weight of the operation. Bridges groaned and sometimes gave way under the relentless pounding of the convoys. The roads themselves were pulverized into fine, choking dust during dry days, blinding the drivers and clogging the engine intakes, and then turned into impassable, sucking mud whenever it rained. The loading process itself was back-breaking labor. Men hauled 80-pound jerry cans and massive crates of rations by hand, forming human chains to fill the trucks in record time before sending them back onto the highway. The men of the Red Ball Express were fighting a relentless war of attrition against the elements, their own machinery, and the absolute limits of human physiology. They fueled themselves on cold rations, stale coffee, and pure adrenaline. The pressure from high command was crushing. Every delayed truck meant a Sherman tank commander having to abandon his vehicle, or an infantry unit running out of ammunition during a firefight. The drivers knew the stakes. They knew that their fatigue was the only thing standing between victory and a bloody stalemate. So they kept their foot on the gas, driving blindly into the dark, ignoring the burning in their muscles, the constant threat of fiery death, and the heavy burden of a segregated military that demanded their lives while denying them their dignity. This was not the sanitized, glorious warfare of recruitment posters. This was the gritty, industrial reality of how wars are actually sustained, measured in destroyed tires, burnt clutches, and the sheer willpower of men who refuse to let the engines die. The climax of the Red Ball Express was not a single decisive battle, but rather a grueling, 82-day marathon of endurance that fundamentally broke the German strategic calculus. By the time the operation officially concluded in mid-November of 1944, the sheer mathematics of what these men had achieved bordered on the miraculous. In less than 3 months, this makeshift conveyor belt of battered trucks and exhausted drivers had moved an astonishing 412,000 tons of supplies. To put that into perspective, that is roughly equivalent to moving the entire weight of the Empire State Building, piece by piece, across hundreds of miles of hostile, war-torn territory, under the constant threat of ambush and in the dead of night. They had driven a collective total of over 122 million ton-miles. It was an industrial triumph that no military academy could have ever predicted or modeled. When reports of this logistical leviathan finally reached the German high command, the initial disbelief and mockery quickly curdled into a cold, paralyzing dread. The seasoned generals of the Wehrmacht, men who had conquered Europe using lightning-fast panzer divisions and meticulous Prussian planning, were forced to confront a terrifying new reality. They realized they were no longer just fighting an Allied army on the ground. They were fighting the mobilized, relentless industrial civilization of the United States. They were fighting the assembly lines of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas, and the sheer, raw determination of thousands of young men who refused to let the engines stop. The German war machine, already crippled by fuel shortages and bombed-out factories, simply could not comprehend, let alone match, a logistics network that could replace a blown engine in a muddy ditch in the middle of the night, or deliver 1 million gallons of gasoline a day to a rapidly moving front line. The temptation to divert these precious supplies was astronomical. On the flourishing French black market, a single jerry can of gasoline or a crate of military rations was worth a small fortune. Desperate civilians and organized criminal syndicates constantly prowled the edges of the convoy routes, offering immense sums of money for a fraction of the cargo. Yet, despite the grueling conditions, the systemic racism they faced from their own commanders, and the meager pay they received, the vast majority of these drivers demonstrated an unshakable integrity. They knew that a missing gallon of fuel wasn't just a lost commodity. It was a stranded tank crew, vulnerable to a German anti-tank gun. The discipline required to guard these convoys while simultaneously battling profound sleep deprivation speaks volumes about the character of the men behind the wheel. The Red Ball Express proved that American combat prowess was intrinsically linked to its logistical supremacy. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was arguably the primary beneficiary of this monumental effort, was able to continue his legendary push toward the German border, liberating swaths of France and keeping the enemy in a state of perpetual retreat. Yet, when the accolades were handed out and the victory parades were planned, the men of the Red Ball Express largely faded back into the shadows. Their operation was quietly disbanded when the critical port of Antwerp finally opened, allowing supply ships to dock much closer to the front lines. The drivers, mechanics, and loaders were dispersed, many of them returning to the thankless, segregated service roles they had occupied before the crisis. They did not receive the glory of the airborne divisions or the armored cavalry. Their uniforms were not adorned with prestigious combat medals, but rather stained permanently with diesel, grease, and the pale dust of the French countryside. But the ghosts of the Red Ball Express still linger on those old, winding roads. They are a testament to the fact that victory in modern warfare is rarely secured solely by the men pulling the triggers. It is secured by the men who ensure the triggers have bullets. It is secured by the unsung heroes who push themselves past the limits of human sanity, staring into the dark, gripping a trembling steering wheel, and driving into the unknown so that others could fight another day. These were the men who delivered the liberation of Europe, 1 gallon, 1 crate, 1 agonizing mile at a time. Thank you for joining me in the archive today. If you appreciate history that digs beneath the superficial headlines and honors the true architects of victory, ensure you subscribe to this channel and open the restricted files. We have many more classified chronicles to uncover. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative and remember that history is never fully written. I am Henry, and the archive is now closed.